Yes, thank you, Krzysztof, and good morning, everybody from me as well. Thank you for joining us yesterday and today for today's discussion, which we will pick up from where we stopped yesterday. I fully agree with Krzysztof that it was a very exciting day with a lot of very interesting and very insightful presentations and interventions from the floor as well. And I'm sure that we will continue in the same vein during our meeting this morning. I think the discussion was so rich that it's really difficult to summarize I wouldn't even pretend that I can do it, but I think we were happy to have already the representatives of different market players, and we could hear from most importantly from some of the main issuers in the region, from Armenia and Georgia, as well as we could hear the point of view of investors and companies which are active, including in our region, on providing second-party opinions, which are a very important element of the process of designing and preparing green bonds. I think one particular issue which came up, I think, and was repeated in many ways, was the fact that there is huge demand by investors in using and investing in this financial instrument. And maybe it's not as visible in our region, but in our region, this is in other regions, this is happening already. We could also see it, by the way, in the case, for example, in the Georgian railway company, which had a significant oversubscription, which allowed the company to get very good financial terms for its green bond. And knowing this, it seems there is more money chasing fewer good projects. And I think this is one issue which comes up in all discussions. I've been doing work on these issues for more than 20 years, and I can tell you that I've heard about the lack of capacity in the countries to prepare good and bankable projects which can attract the attention of investors or get the financing through other channels. And it's one issue which we really have to think about because, as we all know, there is not much time before we go into the really transforming the economies, which will need massive amounts of money. And in order to be adequate to this challenge, we need the involvement and the efforts, really the concerted efforts of all participants in the market, on the private side, on the government side. And we now have the possibility to talk to some people from the government and regulators community. And as Krzysztof said, this first session is really designed to look at what colleagues in the governments and the regulators community are doing in order to speed up and scale up the opportunities to mobilize resources for green investments in order to meet up the low carbon transition challenges. So with this, I would like to invite and to welcome our speakers in the first session, and we will start with our colleague from Georgia, Salome Tvalodze, excuse me, who is macro financial modeling and analysis division head in the National Bank of Georgia. Salome has been working as part of the National Bank team on developing the sustainable finance framework for the banking sector in Georgia for many years now. And I have to say that Georgia is the first, and I think until now, the only country which has done a lot of work in this context. And Georgia has prepared its first reporting and disclosure, ESG reporting and disclosure principles, which are more than principles and more than having remained on paper. I think the real story now is that the National Bank has tried to already enforce these principles and reporting of these principles, and I think it's very valuable. I think the experience of the bank is very important because there will be, I'm sure, a lot of countries which are interested in your work and which will look up to you for inspiration in a way and from learning from you. So with this, I would like to give the floor to Salome and to ask you, Salome, to tell us a little bit more about what you're doing and maybe what are some of the challenges that you've been facing in this process with working with the financial community, with the banking community, and asking them to incorporate ESG criteria into their portfolio risk assessment policies and basically their work. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nelly, for the introduction and for inviting me to share our experience. Let me just share my screen. Just a moment, please. Sorry, I assume it's sometimes a problem. I hope you can see my slides now, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So thank you very much. So today I would like to share our experience about developing NBG's sustainable finance framework. So let me start mentioning that we started developing this framework in 2017. And at the beginning of 2019, we published a roadmap for sustainable finance in Georgia. This is like a main policy document that sets the priorities and also defines the action plan. And the action plan was defined for 2019-2022. So this roadmap introduces 4 main directions, 4 main pillars, and each of them serving different purposes based on our priorities. So first one is about support capacity building and increase awareness. Next one concentrates more how to support sustainable finance flows. And third one is more about ESG risk management, and the last one is about transparency and market discipline. So here you can see the detailed actions under each pillar, and because this action plan was designed for 2019-2022, most of the actions are already implemented or in the process of implementation. And so here you can see the detailed timeline of our actions that we have implemented over the last almost 5 years now to develop this framework and implement the action plan in practice. Of course, I won't go in details and describe all the actions, but I want to concentrate on a few important projects and describe them in more detail. But if you have more questions, I will be happy to answer at the end. So first, I would like to talk about ESG integration, because in order to ensure that ESG issues, including climate-related topics, is incorporated by financial institutions, proper governance is really essential. So one of the first things that we did when we started developing this framework was to incorporate ESG considerations into corporate governance code for commercial banks. And first time we did this was in 2018, when the National Bank for the first time issued corporate governance code for commercial banks. But since during the last few years, since the sustainable finance market, as well as our policies and regulations in this direction has developed, we saw the need to update the CG code and include, incorporate ESG considerations into more comprehensive way. So last year we updated the ESG part of corporate governance code, and currently the main requirements regarding the ESG, the CG code is the following: that the commercial banks need to incorporate ESG issues, including climate-related topics into their strategy and overall risk management framework. So not to look at ESG issues separately, but to incorporate into their core operations and business models. So, and the main body responsible for this to ensure that this is done properly is the supervisory board. So the governance of ESG issues is done at the highest level. And another important requirement that we have in the corporate governance code is ESG-related information disclosure requirements. So it is mandatory for commercial banks. So this is mainly for commercial banks, but as you may know, the commercial banks are main part of our financial system. But last year, the National Bank of Georgia also issued corporate governance code for issuers of public securities, and we also have the ESG part. But unlike corporate governance code for commercial banks, where the requirements are mandatory, in these CG code requirements are based on complier-based approach. So it's less strict, I'd like to say. So, as I mentioned, we have introduced in 2018 the mandatory ESG disclosure requirements for commercial banks. And to ensure that this disclosure was done in a consistent and comparable way, and also to help commercial banks to easily and effectively disclose ESG information, together with OECD, with the help of OECD, we developed ESG reporting and disclosure principles with corresponding template. So these principles tells banks what kind of information we expect them to disclose in terms of ESG. It has and the form is constructed following these principles. So it has both qualitative and quantitative questions. It's based in Excel. It's quite simple form. It has qualitative questions regarding ESG, like how they integrate ESG into business models, due diligence processes, strategies, risk management, and there have KPIs or key performance indicators that has more quantitative questions separately on E, S, and G, like asking banks to disclose information about their green portfolio and social portfolio, asking like social questions like what is a gender diversity among their staff, how consumer protection policies is in place in their commercial banks. Also, there are some questions related to governance, if they are separate unit or person responsible for ESG issues, and so on. So these form are filled by banks annually. And last year, we also added this form to Basel III Pillar 3 annual reporting. So it now, since last year, so the ESG information is disclosed under Pillar 3 annual reporting. And actually last year was the first year when commercial banks disclosed ESG information using these forms. And these forms are now available on our webpage publicly. We already received this year forms as well. So we are now in the process of reviewing these forms, and will be soon available on our webpage as well. So this supports like information, like accessibility of information, transparency, improves transparency, and also encourages banks. And we already see this, that even though it's not a strict requirement, we just ask commercial banks to disclose what they are doing in terms of ESG. We already saw that many banks, those that have not had the ESG policies in place before, because now they have to disclose this information and they don't want to leave these questions empty, they are starting to introduce ESG policies and procedures in their work. So this is also a good sign. So here I also included one graph that shows green loans over the last year and this year's from this year's disclosure. And as you can see, we see an increasing trend in terms of green loans. So the green loan portfolio has increased in Georgia. But here I want to mention a few things. First is as disclosure showed, and as we expected, most of the banks don't have green loan definitions. Only like one or two have a proper definition in place. So most of the banks don't report green loan data, and those who reported, some of them just included only loans related to renewable energy and energy efficiency. So most probably these numbers underestimate the real value of green loans in our financial system, and emphasizes once again the importance. Is there a question or?
No, I think it was some background
Okay.
noise.
Okay. So this also emphasizes once again the importance of having a common definition in the country. So that's that we also had in our agenda to develop a taxonomy. So this is like the next thing I want to discuss. Over the last 2 years, we are working on to develop a sustainable finance taxonomy for Georgia. And at the beginning of May this year, we published a draft of taxonomy for public consultations. So now we are in the process of reviewing and incorporating final comments that we received on this draft. And we plan to publish and officially launch the final version by end of June. So what is this taxonomy framework? So taxonomy framework, first of all, includes, of course, taxonomy. That's, in our case, has two main parts, that is green and social taxonomies. Green taxonomy focuses on the activities that has positive environmental effects, while social taxonomy concentrates and provides a list of activities that aim to achieve social goals. So the taxonomy was developed with active cooperation with various local and international experts, different ministries, financial institutions, and other stakeholders. And together with this taxonomy, we also developed a regulation on loan classification and reporting according to the sustainable finance taxonomy for commercial banks. So the first application of this taxonomy will be for commercial banks, because commercial banks are the main part of our financial system. So this regulation introduces the common definition of green, social, and sustainable loans that banks need to follow, and also introducing the reporting requirements for commercial banks to report according to the taxonomy. So starting from 2024, in the annual ESG forms, the green loan data will be according to the taxonomy. So this will ensure that the data quality will be increased and will be consistent among different commercial banks. And when we see these numbers, we will know for sure that this is actually really green and is eligible for the taxonomy. And another important thing is, like, for many of the commercial banks, and they also asked for the challenges. I guess the main challenge that we face in terms of implementing the framework is a lack of capacity in the financial institutions. The same was for the awareness, but we already see a big improvement among financial institutions about the awareness of sustainable finance issues and topics. However, lack of capacity is still a big problem. So to support banks to implement this taxonomy efficiently in practice, we are also working on screening and reporting tool that will help commercial banks to easily adopt this taxonomy in practice and use in these taxonomies. So this will help banks to easily identify if these new loans are eligible for the taxonomy, and it also will help banks to meet reporting requirements that we have set for commercial banks. And of course, training and capacity building sessions for financial institutions is also part of this project. So once we will develop these tools, then we have a training sessions for commercial banks to teach them how to use this tool and how to implement taxonomy in practice. The next step regarding taxonomy is to develop, based on use this taxonomy and to develop green, social, and sustainable bond framework. This is also in the agenda. So I here also have a screenshot from our taxonomy that you can get some idea what are the main categories that we have: green taxonomy and social taxonomy. And of course, this taxonomy is consistent with international best practice. It quite closely follows EU taxonomy, but we tried to make and tailor it to Georgian reality and specifics of Georgian financial and economy. So the technical criteria in most cases is based on EU taxonomy, but we also took into account of regulations that exist in Georgia. So this is about the taxonomy, and as for the next steps for an agenda for 2022, because this action plan was designed for 2022, and we will finalize this action plan this year, and we will start developing a new action plan next year. So what we have in the agenda for this year, first of all, it's about we are starting to develop ESG risk management guidelines. So far, we have requirements for commercial banks to do ESG risk management, but so far we have not provided any guidelines or expectations what banks need to follow. So this is really important to ensure that banks are doing ESG risk management properly. So this is number one in our agenda, to develop ESG risk management guidelines. We are also working on ESG scorecards that will be used as progress measurement tool to evaluate where the weak points, how the market develops, and where they need more help. We also started to incorporate specifically climate-related risk assessment in our framework. We already prepared a report that develops a climate risk radar for Georgian economic sectors and sees what are the exposure of commercial banks to these high-risk sectors. Next step is we're just starting to develop climate scenarios for Georgia that will be using NGFS scenarios as a reference scenarios, and we'll perform scenario analysis, and we aim to finalize this work by end of this year, and we have a climate stress testing in the agenda for the next year. And also last year first time we published a sustainable finance status report. It's like a small report that has two main components. First one is outlines and summarizes all the policies and regulations we are implementing regarding sustainable finance, and also the second part summarizes the main findings from ESG reporting forms that banks are disclosing, as well as green bond developments in Georgia. So we will continue. This will be an annual report, so we will publish this report this year as well. And also we are annually organizing Sustainable Finance Conference, so we also plan to organize this conference this year as well. So these are the main things that we have done, and the main actions that we have planned for this year. and like a short summary. So thank you very much. And if you have questions, please let me know.
Thank you, Salome. The only thing I can say is, wow, really, I'm really impressed with what you've been doing. I wonder how many people you have in your team who are doing all this work, because I think it's really very well thought. I can see that the logic in what you've been doing and how you have gone through all the necessary elements in a very comprehensive and consistent way at the same time. I particularly like the fact that you have included in your commercial bank code the fact that in banks, it's at a very high level with the supervisory boards where the push should come from for the staff in the banks to work along these issues and to incorporate ESG criteria in the risk management practices and portfolios. And going from there to the taxonomy and doing all the other elements, it's really impressive. Particularly given that you are the first one in the region doing this work, as I said. With this, as I said, or as Krzysztof mentioned also earlier, if there are any specific questions to Salome, Krzysztof, do we have any questions, please? In the
no, I don't see any questions in the chat. I would invite everyone to put questions, share comments in the chat. Let's just see if there is anyone wishing to take the floor. I don't see it, or just to give a bit of time to think about it. I also would have, in addition to actually Nelly's question about how many people do this excellent work, really impressive work, my question is, what's the driving force? What was the driving force for sustainable finance strategy? What was the driving force for introducing the ESG principles? What's the driving force then for the taxonomy?
Thank you very much for the questions. First, about our team. So our team is quite small. It's so my team includes just 2 people and myself. So we are really a short team, but yeah, we have support from the top management. So this sustainable finance is one of our priorities. So we always get their support, and we have a number of partners that are helping us through expertise or some other technical assistance that also very helpful for us to develop this framework. As for the what was the motivation? So one of our main mandate is to ensure financial stability, and I guess now we all agree that sustainability issues and climate-related risks can be source of financial risks and create financial stability risks. That's why we need to make sure that financial institutions are taking these risks and are identifying, measuring, and managing them properly. So the main motivation was to ensure that we don't have any financial stability risks from sustainability issues. And the second is what sustainable finance is about, is to support move capital and financial resources to more sustainable projects, and in this sense to support sustainable development of the country. So that was 2 main motivations: first to manage risk, and then to support transition and sustainable development of the country.
Thank you very much. If we don't have any other questions, I just
sorry, Nelly, there is a hand from George Abulashvili. So we may actually take one question and then let's move to the next, because we will have more time for discussion afterwards. So
thank you, George, for giving me a floor. I'll try to be very short. Salome, thanks for all your efforts.
Sorry, can you unmute, George? Can you unmute you? Yes.
Sorry. Should I start from the beginning?
Yes, please.
Oh, sorry. I'll try to be very short then. Salome, thanks for the information shared. It is really impressive what you've done. May I ask you to elaborate a little bit on the practical challenges you faced while after the introduction, those innovative approaches and the challenges local commercial banks have faced? that's I think would be also very important for the audience to learn about. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. So when we are starting this process of developing framework, one of the main challenges that we face, not only among financial institutions but within the ABG as well, was lack of capacity and also awareness about these sustainability issues, why it is important, why commercial banks or financial institutions need to look at these sustainability or ESG risks, and why they need to dedicate resources to these issues. Because we already had a few commercial banks that we are quite advanced and have been doing this work for years, but for most, especially for smaller banks, it was completely new. What I can say that in terms of awareness, we really see a progress, and here important thing was that to include them in this process. So for this, we introduce a sustainable finance working group where we have members from financial institutions, so they are part of the process. We discuss with them our plans. We share draft versions of our policy documents or regulations or guidelines, and we receive feedbacks and comments from them and try to incorporate as much as possible. We also have separate individual meetings with commercial banks to more clearly see their needs, problems, challenges in this process. So this coordination and communication, I think, is key and very important to ensure that this framework is successfully implemented. And the main challenge we still face is capacity, lack of capacity, and we also have plans in this regard in terms of trainings, capacity building sessions. Now we are working with our partners to develop, to help these trainings for commercial banks, and also by providing this support or principles or templates, forms, working with them is the main goal is to support them to easily and effectively implement our policies and regulations. So it's not like we introduce a regulation and just tell commercial banks now we have to implement it. We are working with them in the whole process, so they know in advance what to expect, what new regulations are coming, and then we are also helping in the process to effectively implement these new regulations and policies.
Yes, thank you very much. Very good points about the way the national regulator can and should work with the banks in the country in promoting the regulations and the requirements. I have one quick question to you, though. You were talking about the taxonomy and how it applies to banks and help them identify and measure their financing assets, green financing assets. But I was wondering whether this taxonomy can eventually apply to issuers of green bonds in the country. Have you envisaged this possibility in particularly if it is financial who will be issuing such bonds in Georgia? Have you envisaged this possibility?
Thanks a lot, Nelly, for this question. Yeah, definitely. First application was for commercial banks because they are the main part of our financial system, but definitely, and we already had a first discussion with our capital market supervision department. So they will be in charge of developing green, social, and sustainable bond guidelines, but we will want frameworks, but we will be also involved, and it will use taxonomy, and it will be based on taxonomy to define eligible projects. So this is also in the plan, of course.
Okay, obviously. Thank you very much. Thank you for your intervention. I think it's time now to move to our next speaker, and we have Aigul Kussaliyeva from Kazakhstan. I think Aigul is a well-known member of the international community, and many of you may know her. She is now actually the managing director of the Green Finance Center within or under the Astana International Financial Center. And I think she's been working on these issues for many, many years, and she's been involved in developing the green finance system of Kazakhstan, the concept of such a green finance system of Kazakhstan. She's been involved in developing green bond rules for the Astana exchange. She's also worked on the green taxonomy of Kazakhstan, so she really has a lot of hands-on experience with developing this sort of guiding principles and regulations. So with this, I would like to invite Aigul to share the experience, your experience and your achievements, I would say, in doing this work, because you work not only on the policy side, but I understand that you work also with investors, both investors and issuers. You're a little bit of a matchmaker, helping them to connect, and you have, again, first-hand experience in preparing green bond issuance in Kazakhstan. So please share with us your knowledge and your experience with helping develop the market in Kazakhstan.
Right. Thank you, Nelly. First of all, let me thank you for having me on this panel. We truly appreciate our long-standing partnership with OECD, especially on the matters like development of green bond market. And in fact, green bond was identified as one of the main instruments to be developed on the AIFC platform back in 2017 to launch the green finance market, actually. And I'm happy to share that currently the overall sustainable finance market in Kazakhstan exceeds $250 million US, and that includes not only green, but also social finance instruments. Let me share my screen so you can see the slides. All right. So as Nelly mentioned already, we developed this concept of green financial system for Kazakhstan with the support of EBRD in 2017. And this is the main document, sort of outlining those main priorities for us in developing the market. And AIFC Green Finance Center was established within the ecosystem of financial center to support the green capital market. So AIFC itself is a special legal zone within the capital city of Kazakhstan, which was created to develop the capital market. And it also provides special tax incentives for financial firms registered with our financial center. And there are certain institutions within the ecosystem which are targeting development not only of green financial market, also Islamic finance, fintech, and other directions. Currently, our center provides not only these, matchmaking, let's say, services to investors and issuers, as you mentioned, Nelly. We're also involved in this policy development process, and we also provide commercial services for the issuers of green bonds in the form of second-party opinion. And I would like to, mention few maybe green finance initiatives we had in Kazakhstan since inception, which are quite important. And I would say they are in line with those which were mentioned by Salome as well. First of all, it's a green bond rules, which were adopted on both stock exchanges on AIX and KASE in Kazakhstan. And also it's important to mention that KASE provides special, conditions or let's say discounts for placement of sustainable finance instruments, so both like for green and social bonds. And I also want to mention here that the definitions of green finance instruments and green taxonomy were included in the new environmental code of Kazakhstan. This is I would say very important achievement, because both for investors, for issuers, for project developers and the other market players, it's quite important to understand the definition, so to avoid the greenwashing. And going forward, continuing those efforts, we've been working on development of green taxonomy for last 2 years. And in December last year, the green taxonomy was adopted by the government, and currently it can be used by market players. And, we always need certain supporting measures for small and medium enterprises to incentivize them to use the green finance instruments. Therefore, our team was working on special measures, which then were translated in the special state program for small and medium enterprises in a way of provision of subsidies for green projects. So currently there is a state program called Roadmap for Business 2025. And within this program, those projects which are in line with the thresholds of national green taxonomy can apply for the subsidies to cover the expenses for coupon payment of green bonds and interest rate of green loans up to 50%. And on this slide, you can see the details of this government program, both for loans and for the coupon rates of green bonds. And I would like to highlight here that because of the COVID-related measures in past 2 years, most of the governments in the world, but I would say maybe even all the governments, were channeling the funding to social issues related projects. And there's also a growing demand from asset managers to targets, let's say like quantified targets, right? KPI linked targets. And all this leads to development of new instruments, not only green bonds, but also social bonds, SDG linked bonds, or I'm sure you heard about sustainability linked bonds, etc. Therefore, our center is operating now in this new environment, let's say in a wider universe of ESG. Therefore, we are planning to work not only on development of green bond market, but also to push the development of new instruments. Going forward, we are planning to, first of all, continue working with business more closely to bring up the issue of non-financial reporting, which is quite important for the agenda. And in fact, we are planning to introduce services for companies to provide them this ESG disclosure. And currently, we're also working on a new policies that includes social taxonomy development. In fact, we did develop the first draft of the social taxonomy and submitted it to the Ministry of National Economy. And the first, let's say, official sort of discussion of the draft will happen in the end of this month within our annual conference, Astana Finance Days. And I would like to take this opportunity to invite all the participants here to join this session, to join this discussion. And I will leave the link to the registration in the chat box so that everyone can access that. And we hope that social taxonomy will also sort of provide the classification for project developers and investors, because our business development team is indeed working on matchmaking the developers of the projects with investors, and we see that demand from the market that they need this clarification on type of the projects. And we're also planning to work on the development of new instruments. As I mentioned, we do not stop only on green bonds. We already developed the methodology of SLBs, sustainability-linked bonds, external opinion. And in fact, this instrument is the most fastest growing right now in the sustainable universe market. And we would like to introduce this in our market as well. Of course, this instrument is not something which can be done by small or medium enterprises. It's rather for large companies, and we're happy that certain government-owned, state-owned enterprise in Kazakhstan already have these ESG strategies in place, and they are, in fact, well placed to issue these bonds and attract cheaper funding, for reaching their ESG targets. And I also want to mention here, you can see here those projects we had so far, and those green and social bonds which we issued in Kazakhstan with the support of our center. And I just would like to mention the largest green bond, which took place last year in November, and it was issued by state-owned enterprise Samruk Energy. And so far, it's like the largest one, and it took place on our exchange on AIX. Our center provided the full support and external review in the form of second-party opinion for these issues. And on this slide, you can also see some statistics for your reference, the type of issues we had, the names of the issues, and the overall size of the market and the breakdown. And I remember, Nelly, you mentioned during our first discussion about this event, the challenges that we would like to bring it up here, right? And there are few challenges I would like to highlight. First of all, it's not, let's say, not clear signal from the government still. Those initiatives I mentioned earlier, such as development of green bond rules, and these, incentives for small and medium enterprises, development of green taxonomy, those initiatives were brought up to the government by AIFC, and other institutions involved in the development of the market, like stock exchanges. So there were no initiatives which were brought to the market by the regulator or some government organizations. Therefore, it's very important to have this certain signal, sent to the market, so the market players can understand that it's something they need to, pay attention to. But being said that, I'm happy to share that our national financial regulator just recently joined the Sustainable Banking and Finance Network, and there were several, MOUs signed between the regulator with international financial institutions such as EBRD and AIFC, to work on these issues. And just a couple of days ago, we got email saying that finally there will be a working group established under the agency to work on the development of sustainable finance market. So finally, we are kind of, getting to the point where the main financial regulator is sending this signal to the market. And another point I want to mention here, it's the cost of money. I like the way it was highlighted in the OECD study, actually we gathered to discuss today, right? That indeed, in emerging markets, the cost of money is let's say kind of high, taking into account the shallow capital markets. And of course, it's something, beyond only green bond, not only like green bond, right? But beyond that, it's like an overall issue for the development of capital market. And I also want to support the thesis which was brought by Salome on the capacity building. In fact, just yesterday, I was on another discussion on the nuclear plant, on the building of nuclear plant in Kazakhstan. And one of the issues which were brought there too, it's a capacity building. For operating that nuclear plant in Kazakhstan, we'll need more than 2,000 people, highly trained people. And those people need to be trained for this particular reactor, which will be built there, in our country, right? And the same here, we need experts, not only, let's say, like certain economists, right? Or, I don't know, like financiers. We need people who will be involved in the risk management, but have this certain training on ESG, right? And we need these experts who are in corporate governance, but they also have these certain trainings on ESG. And this is something which also needs to be covered by the government. And one more point I want to mention here, it's banking sector. So all of the slides, we're mostly talking about the development of capital market, of course, because we're gathering here to talk about green bonds, right? But taking into account that we're emerging markets and still the banking sector actually is taking the most of the financial market space, we do need to provide certain guidelines for the banks and help channeling their funds, to green projects. And therefore, it's important to, for the regulator actually to, put some guidelines for them. And in fact, our center has been working on this idea for last year and a half, I think. And we applied for the grant of Green Climate Fund for the readiness program to fund the project to support the central bank and the regulator in setting up this kind of, let's say, framework for banks. And I'm happy to share that in February this year, the GCF board finally approved our readiness proposal. And we will be hoping to start this project maybe in the second half of this year. And basically the idea of the project is to develop the roadmap for the national regulator on sustainable finance, develop the guideline on environmental and social risks for second-tier banks, and also to develop the guidelines on green loan reporting. Because I think everyone will agree here that we need to have the information in hand to see if those policies we're providing are working well, We need to compare the data, right, and see what's wrong. And having that data, which was shown by Salome, for instance, about the green loans provided by the banks, that definitely gives some insights to the central bank how to move going forward. I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Excuse me, I think I was muted. Just to say, yes, thank you for this very interesting and very substantive presentation and the excellent points you make. Before I ask you a couple of questions which came to my mind while listening to you, I wanted to see if there are colleagues from the floor who may have questions to you. I don't see on my side any hands raised. And no questions in the chat box.
No, there are no. Please go ahead.
No, yes. Well, I first wanted to say that you're probably one of the, if not the only country in the region where the government has put in place certain incentives measures, and it's already a huge step forward. But I think your point that the national regulator and the government needs to do their part of the exercise, because for me, you have done a lot for them. You've been supporting your government in improving the market, and you've done a lot already. But indeed, without the very high level, at the very high government level, I think things will go much more slowly. From this perspective, I wanted to ask you, you are talking about developing more guidelines, putting in place a working group which will steer the process. But I was wondering, in Kazakhstan in particular, you have other opportunities like potential institutional investors which may be involved in financing the green energy transition. You have the wealth sovereign fund, pension system, and I was wondering whether you would know, of course, you're not part, formally speaking, of the government, but these are significant financing opportunities, and I was thinking whether there is any discussion in the country, in the government, about incentivizing this these potential sources to also participate in financing the significant financing needs in the country.
Right. Thank you for the question. Actually, Nelly, it's very right one. You're bringing up. In fact, just recently, the Ministry of National Economy was working on development of a new investment policy of the country. And first time the ESG issues were included in the investment policy, national investment policy. And basically the wealth, Samruk Kazna and those funds which are being operated by central bank will need to follow these guidelines, and there will be some criterion developed for the, for investing in such projects for these funds. And once these things are in place, I'm sure those funds will follow, by investing in the green projects.
Yes, I think there are some huge opportunities there, and they should, the country should tap into them and think how to use them really very consistently. Okay, and I
sorry, Nelly, there is actually one question, so let's pick it up at this moment. Directly to Aigul from Ellen Alfaidze. Can you please elaborate more about subsidy programs for the issuers, e.g. interest rate cover and the procedure?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. So basically those projects which fall under the green taxonomy of Kazakhstan, when the project developers actually applying for the loans through the second-tier banks, they can mention the program, and the project developer will need to provide the report, external review, confirming that the project is in line with the taxonomy. Once that's done, they can go through the, regular procedure with the bank to get the loan, and then the subsidy will be provided to the bank, which will then cover that for the project developer. And they can send the link to the, official legislation regarding this in the chat box, so you can read more detailed and see what type of projects there and what type of institutions can provide that external review for you, and see the whole procedure there, if that helps.
Thank you, Aigul. I think it will definitely help. I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in this particular issue and how it's done in Kazakhstan. But I was thinking in this context, maybe can you tell us how long or since when the first subsidy schemes were put in place? And more importantly, I was wondering, it's one thing to provide these these arrangements and to have these opportunities, to give these opportunities to borrowers, but also, has there been any analysis of the implementation of the schemes and what the results are, because it's one thing to give the money, but another thing, I think it's another thing to see the outcomes and maybe the actual achievements and actual reductions achieved as a result of the support provided by the government.
Yeah, exactly. So the subsidy scheme was introduced only this year because it was a state program, and there were certain, changes within the government system, how the government looked at these programs. So they used to be called state programs. Now they are called national projects. So there was like a certain process, where the government was like, I don't know, like let's say like verifying, like kind of, redoing the way it works. But the project already started this year. However, there wasn't project. There was any project yet financed. But we hope that within like the project will be going like for 5 years. So going forward, like on the annual basis, or of course, like after 5 years, the government will do this analysis and see what are the results. But one thing I want to share here as a result of the work, I mean, like some, nice example, the first issuance of green bond, which took place in 2020, it was issued by the MU Fund. So the proceeds from this issuance was used to finance the the renewable project in the southern Kazakhstan and Turkestan region. It's the solar panels, and it was really nice, after some time to see the photo of that solar, plant in Kazakhstan, which was directly financed by the issuance of green bond. So that might be the nice example I can share.
You can see the link directly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much for these explanations. We have actually for you a couple of other questions from the floor, from colleagues in the meeting. And the first one concerns the municipal types of projects. And the question is about municipal projects which and critical infrastructure projects at the municipal level. Have you covered this type of municipal, for example, bonds and rules for municipal bonds in your regulations and taxonomies?
Yeah, this is quite important question too. In fact, according to our national, budget legislation, municipalities can issue the bonds. They can borrow the funds only for certain type of projects, and unfortunately, there is no criteria for green projects. So there are projects for, I forget the word now, for jobs creation. And then it's about providing the construction of housing. So these type of projects. And our team actually for a couple of years already has been working with the Ministry of Finance actually to amend this, legislation. So to have the municipalities, to make the municipalities be able to issue the green bonds. And actually AIFC office in Kazakhstan is also involved in this process. But as far as I know, so far there wasn't progress on this amendments part. Once it's done, actually municipalities could issue the green bonds. But also another point here to mention with municipalities, they already have a lot of borrowings, and some of them, they are not in a position to issue more because, they need to kind of cover those, right? And that's another
limits. Yes.
Yeah, the borrowing limits already reached. Yeah, so that's like another topic for discussion, let's say.
No, but it's a very important issue, I think, indeed, because we have to look at different types of opportunities and issuance at the municipal level. Well, most of the heavy investment and climate-related infrastructure we have to think how we can have municipal bonds, used more in this investment process. Yes.
It would be even better to have sovereign issuance. If you looked at that table, you would see that most of the issuers were financial institutions like banks. There was, of course, some of them like quasi-state-owned enterprises, but we do need, sovereign issuance. That will be the, great case.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you, and we already had some discussion around this yesterday as well. I want to thank you very interesting information, very useful. And before I move to our next colleague, I just want to say that there is a request from Ukraine. If one way or another you can share with us more information on the subsidy schemes in Kazakhstan, that would be very useful for everybody in the region to learn from you. So if you can send, for example, to me this information, we can circulate it afterwards to all our colleagues who are with us at the meeting these days. Thank you very much, Aigul. And I will now like to move to, as I said, our next speaker, who is Stanislav Dubko. I think I saw Stanislav. Stanislav?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, thank you very much for being with us. You have worked with us on this project since day one, and you've worked on environmental finance and management issues for many, many years, both in Ukraine and beyond Ukraine, in other countries in the region. So you are very well familiar with the markets. You worked for rating agencies again in Ukraine. So you have really a lot of experience in this field. And it is for this reason that we, in discussing the agenda with you and with colleagues on the project, we decided to ask you to actually speak about the experience of Ukraine with regulating the market, and what again maybe some of the main challenges that you've seen in your work, and I think Ukraine is really an interesting case from this perspective, and we hope to hear from you more about these issues. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction and for the kind words. I've prepared a small presentation. It's just basically 4 slides. The presentation, can it be shown on the screen now, or do I need to share it myself?
If you want, we can help you, but if you prefer to do it and to manage it yourself, please do so.
Yeah, let me just share my screen. Am I allowed to do it generally?
Yes, you should be able to do it.
Okay, yeah. Just a second then. Okay, do you see my screen now?
Yes, we do.
Second, I'll start the slideshow. Okay. So yes, I've prepared these 4 slides. They are, of course, based on the study, the results of this study we made in Ukraine during this assessment within the framework of OECD project. But I will try to speak a little bit also more on the, given the topic of this particular panel and the role of regulators in defining green bond markets or sustainable finance markets. I will speak more from the point of view of regulators and what was the Ukrainian experience. I was also lucky to be involved from the very beginning in some working groups that worked on development of green bond market in Ukraine, and this work started in 2019. So just very briefly on the first slide, I would like to say, this was already mentioned yesterday, that within this study, there was a separate effort to assess investment needs which could be covered by green finance instruments, green bonds in particular. And this was done by Berlin Economics. So according to a specific methodology. For Ukraine, this is the figures you see on your screen right now, hopefully. So you will see some sectors where green finance could be directed to. So the estimations are, they were within the range of between 27 and 40 billion euro to be invested until 2030. This is the investment needs, again, to be covered by green finance instruments, ranging from electricity sector, the biggest demand from there, basically to most of this demand would be for introducing new renewable energy facilities. and all the way to residential buildings, public buildings, industry applications, and transport sector investment. Now, of course, given the current situation and the war going on in Ukraine, these figures have to be completely rewritten and rethought. Here on this slide, I gave you the estimation made by the made in April by somehow forget the name. It's Kiev School of Economics. Yes, that's the right name. Kiev School of Economics estimated the direct damage to the Ukrainian infrastructure at 84 billion in mid-April because of the war. Now, just recently, 2 days ago, World Bank came up with their own estimation, and they already talk about the figure direct damage to infrastructure exceeding 100 billion US dollars, and this figure has not stopped yet. So the damage is continued to be done. So we are talking about significant, additional investment needed for Ukraine, and discussions are ongoing right now already how this, rebuilding Ukraine can be, rebuilt back better and in a sustainable way, in a green way. But of course, this is just goes to say that the investment needs are huge. Now, let me just give you a little bit more information on the two green bond issues, which were issued in Ukraine previously. This was briefly mentioned yesterday in the discussions. So the bond issue by Detect Renewables, this was actually the pioneering bond, the first bond in the region that we are talking about today. It was issued by our largest renewable energy producer in Ukraine. This was a 325 million euro bond issue for wind and solar generation facilities. Now, as was already mentioned yesterday, unfortunately, given the fact that investors in most cases are not really willing to take construction risk, in projects in the region, this was basically a refinancing transaction because the company had to finance the construction phase with the different types of finance, and only at a later stage they were able to refinance the project by issuing green bonds. So this was all done in a very proper way. The issue had a second party opinion by Sustainalytics. The company already issued two impact reports in 2020 and 2021, reporting on the impact of the investment. And as was again mentioned already, I will probably refer a lot to things that was said yesterday. This issue was of high interest to investors, was highly oversubscribed, and as many other issues properly structured and proposed to the investors. So unfortunately, the problem with this issue was that even if it started in a very high note and had a very high interest from investors, because of the changes in the government support scheme for feed-in tariff for renewables, the government, the investors, they enjoyed having one of the highest tariffs, fixed tariffs worldwide for the electricity produced from renewables. But unfortunately, at some point of time, the Ukrainian government realized that they're having troubles to support this high tariff, and they initiated negotiations to restructure some of the debts that already accumulated for payment of this tariff. And also they made some retroactive cuts of the tariff, which was of course not met favorably by investors, and we even have some court proceedings right now. So this led to the issue becoming illiquid on the market, and unfortunately no further issues followed. In fact, the second green bond issue is in a way related to the first one. Last year, Ukrenergo, the Ukrainian TSO, transmission system operator, issued a bond that was also mentioned yesterday, and it's a dual framework. It's not just green, bond framework, but also sustainability-linked bonds, also assessed by Sustainalytics. Pretty high amount, big volume of issue, more than 800 million US dollars. Again, highly oversubscribed by the investors, which was probably helped in this case by the presence of the state guarantee to the issue, and also by EBRD acting as the anchor investor and investing 75 million into this issue. Even though the framework says that this issue is meant for repayment of debts to the producers of energy, and also to other applications like introduction of new renewable energy facility investment and reconstruction of transmission system, renovation of transmission system. In fact, all of the funds went to repay this government debt to the renewable energy producers. So basically, this second Ukrainian green bond issue proceeds from this were basically used to repay the debts including to accompany Detect Renewables, who issued the first bond. So this was it for the Ukrainian experience as of now for issuing bonds externally in the international markets. Again, the topic that we're discussing right now is how regulators can influence the local market development. But I just wanted to say that so far, until now, it was possible to issue, and it is possible to issue green bonds internationally without any local framework in place, because we are governed here by international rules and practices. But as you know already, the EU is going to implement green bond standard. So it seems that the market started to develop as completely, driven by the market initiative to issue green bonds and use proceeds from these bonds in a particular way. But now the regulators in Europe are putting a more rigid system in place where, according to this green bond standard in Europe, only those issuers the rules will be quite strict. So it means that you can only issue green bonds if you, and you can call your bonds green if you issue them according to specific rules. And one of the important rules there is presence of this second party opinion review made by an external reviewer. And also these external reviewers, they are not regulated at this moment of time, but they will be regulated according to the new European legislation, very much like credit rating agencies are regulated right now by ESMA, the European regulator. So the idea is that external reviewers will have to be, let's say, licensed and regulated and overseen by ESMA as the European regulator for financial and capital markets. But now this slide actually explains what happened in Ukraine starting from 2019 with respect to development of the local framework for issuance of green bonds. So in 2019, the work started to revamp and modernize some of the local legislation related to capital markets. So the law on capital markets was significantly reshuffled, and there, as part of this work, green bonds were introduced into the legislation as a specific class of debt instruments, giving some idea and some definition of this instrument, this new instrument. Now, these changes only came into force on July 2021, last year. And then additional work started to prepare some secondary legislation. So very important, one of the very important things is definitely to have a taxonomy of projects. And I'm happy to see that many countries adopt such taxonomies. And we just heard from Georgia that in December last year, such taxonomy was adopted in Georgia. So in Ukraine, Ministry of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources was involved in drafting a certain regulation, which was initially only planned to cover issuance by the government and the local authorities, municipalities. And this procedure also included, this draft procedure included a taxonomy and technical criteria to assess projects. So far, this document has not been finalized yet, as far as I know, and the work is continued, hopefully. But again, adoption of such a document, I think, is quite an important step to make quite clear on the market which particular projects are considered to be green and can be financed by green bonds. Now, the NSSMC stands for National Stock Security, National Commission for Stock Market and Capital Market and Securities Markets. This commission has quite recently, I think it was last year, adopted non-binding recommendations for issuance of green bonds. It was developed with the technical assistance from AIFC. And also, as of the end of last year, this commission was working to adopt some additional requirements to the existing secondary legislation related to issuance of bonds by corporates and by municipalities, to include some specific reporting measures, some reporting requirements to such documents. Again, I'm not sure at this point of time whether this work is continued and at what pace, but this is what is expected to be done by the Commission. Now, with respect to the other standards on the market, I would say that so far there are no regulations or standards applied in the asset management industry, and frankly speaking, this industry is not on a very in a very developed stage at the moment. So this is probably something that needs to be done a bit later. So far, we had no local providers of external review services, but companies can always, of course, use external providers from other markets, international ones. And we've talked a lot today in context of Georgia about in Kazakhstan, actually. By the way, I also meant Kazakhstan when I said about the taxonomy adopted last year in December. But there is quite a bit of discussion in interest in Ukraine to think about how to motivate, issuance of green bonds in particular, whether this should be any favorable tax regime or any subsidies to cover some of the additional costs to issue green bonds. But discussions have been going on, but no decision has been made yet. So this will be very last slide. I'll try to be quick also on this one. It was already mentioned with respect to other countries that, well, first of all, the possibility to issue green bonds locally on any particular market in the region very much depends on how the bond market is developed in general. And the case of Ukraine is quite specific. The country had a very well-developed and vibrant bond market in the period from 2004 and until end of 2009 or even 2010. But then the only government bond market remained to be very active and has significant volumes. Unfortunately, the market for municipal bonds or corporate bonds has not been able to come back to, after the crisis of 2009, to any significant levels, even comparable with what was happening before, So unfortunately, this is one of the problems in Ukraine in particular, that crises happen quite often and levels of defaults are quite high in this case on unsecured, debt instruments. So this is one of the barriers to actually issue green bonds in Ukraine. Again, so far, Ukraine had a successful story in attracting foreign investors to government bonds. In particular, this was due to the fact that it was possible to organize a very efficient infrastructure for foreign investors. This was not the case for corporate bonds, and so far, exposure of international investors to local market was very limited in case of government, in case of corporate or municipal bonds. And again, the capital markets, local capital markets, are quite shallow in general. There's no institutional investors as a significant class, of investors on the local market to invest into securities. And this is, of course, made even more difficult because of some other issues going on. So Ukraine has had a history of quite difficult and ongoing reforms and problems. Country was trying to combat, for many years. Like, for instance, the rule of law has not been properly instilled yet in Ukraine, and this remains to be a significant problem. Now, with the war risks, wartime, situation in Ukraine right now, of course, this brings a lot of even more challenging issues on the table for Ukraine. With respect to development of the capital markets, of course, this would only be possible when the situation stabilizes for Ukraine. So this is probably where I'm going to end my presentation, and maybe there'll be some questions I can answer in addition to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. Very interesting presentation with a lot of details and a lot of food for thought. I think many countries will be looking at the experience of Ukraine from before the war and certainly after the war, because it will be a very key period of reconstructing the country, and I'm sure there will be a lot of needs to think about using the bond instrument and including the green bond instrument as a source of longer-term financing for reconstructing Ukraine. I think you have we could have seen that the government before the war used different possibilities to provide incentives to the market and to finance in green bonds, including state guarantees. You had the anchor investors from the international community, and in certain cases we could see how certain things went wrong because of, for example, the feed-in tariff, which was not very well designed, and the government had to step back their obligations to investors. But because we are running a little bit out of time, I think our colleagues can read about this in our report as well. There is more information on that. I have two questions to you, which come from the floor from our colleagues. One concerns the, let me check. Specifically, yes, very specific question related to the investment needs that we try to estimate as part of our work. And the question is why the district heating sector and the water supply sector were not included in the estimates of the investment needs that an investment that can be financed through bond issuance.
Frankly speaking, yeah, it's a separate discussion. Probably we don't have much time to do it right now. I would really refer you to that specific report that provides all the justification for these figures and why specific sectors were chosen. So the buildings sector, I cannot give you details right now. Maybe this district heating investment could be even included in the building sector, but I'm not sure about that. So let's better refer to the specific report on this issue.
I think we can look at this and get back to our colleagues after the meeting. There is another question from a colleague from Ukraine about ecosystem services and green bonds, if there is any experience with financing such services through green bonds. I myself am not aware of this, but I think we can definitely try to look into this issue and find out if there is any experience anywhere in the world, and we will get back to people with the information depending on whatever we find out in our research. And before I close this discussion, I want to thank our colleague from Lithuania who is providing information about work that they've done, being among the first ones to issue green bonds, and we are actually very interested to get this information. So thank you very much for this. We will make use of it, and we now and thank you, Stan, for your help. And
sorry, Nelly, there is a question from Harald. So I think we should take it.
Oh yes, sorry,
he has been waiting.
Sorry, I missed
waiting
it.
for a bit.
Yes, that's right. Harold is asking how to deal with the debt overhang before getting a green bond market going again in Ukraine. I think personally it's a very big question, and it's not probably easy to respond to right now, because indeed the debt that the country is facing and will be facing probably is enormous.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure what Harold means. Maybe he means the debt overhang, the still existing debt before the renewable energy producers, and this is of course a problem problem for the trust of the investors in the market of renewable energy producers. If the previous system of support, this fixed-in feed-in tariff, is no longer in place, the government was thinking about introducing a new government support scheme, and of course the level of trust will not be there because of the previous problems, if this is the question. But again, with time, investors, they tend to be, going into the markets or sectors where they even had some problems before, but 5 to 7 years can actually make them more, more able to, again, to take the risks, basically. If you talk about the debt in terms of Ukraine in general, again, the situation has to stabilize, and it's at a certain level. Of course, the government right now has a huge deficit, and the war expenses are difficult to finance, and the help is coming. And I'm not sure what the government debt would look like after the end of the war, but we need to go from there. I mean, for the local bond market development, this is not such a big issue. If you talk about the, investment into private projects locally.
Nelly, may I perhaps ask my question? Thank you very much, Stanislav, for the explanation. And indeed, I was referring predominantly on the sovereign debt, right? And which is, of course, a huge threat there for private investors, etc. So I wanted to go perhaps one step further to see again an opportunity in how obviously one needs to address this debt overhang in a very systematic way, and that one way would be to have debt for nature swaps, and you can also embed that in green bonds, that you restructure the debt with green bonds. And I think there are innovative solutions which would really help to move a number of reform agendas forward after the war. But everything is, one needs to deal with the aggression right now, and then we think later how to restructure the debt. I fully agree with that approach of the government. But I wanted to point out these green bonds have, as an instrument, are very attractive also to discuss possibly debt restructuring. They play an important role in any debt restructuring efforts, and that's why I was wondering whether you had already some insights in that, further ideas, but perhaps it's too early indeed.
I can only say that discussions are ongoing right now. This has to do, the idea to swap, the government debt with the green bonds, meaning that obligation of Ukraine to invest money into specific, green or sustainable projects. It's also being discussed, but this has to do with the whole concept of how to actually, in a practical way, do this green or sustainable reconstruction of Ukraine to rebuild better, because it's again it's a difficult topic being discussed right now on all levels, because on one hand you may have a situation when, for instance, there's an urgent need to repair some of the damaged residential buildings. Maybe half of the roof is taken off. We need to quickly rebuild that, repair that, so that the rain doesn't spoil the whole building. And it's difficult, these little repairs, but on a large scale, difficult to do in such a way that this would be like a complete change of the envelope of the building in a proper way, so that the building becomes green. So it's a difficult issue to deal with, and we definitely do not have the time today to probably go there.
Yes, thank you, Stan. I just wanted to say that it's a very important and very good question that Harold is asking, and I'm absolutely sure that once the war is over, the government will be heavily involved in the discussions and negotiations with the creditor countries on restructuring, maybe writing off some of the debt, sovereign debt. Indeed, the question is how much of this whether the sovereign debt is as big as the private creditors' debt. And when we talk about the potential swap arrangements, like the debt for environment swaps or climate or debt for climate swaps, until recently, these arrangements and these agreements have been done within the context of this so-called Paris Club of creditor countries. But I think in the case of Ukraine in particular, it might be worth thinking whether whether private creditors should be involved in the restructuring of this sort of restructuring schemes, because we've done work on this earlier in a number of countries. And I can tell you that many years ago, right after, I think it was the Russian financial crisis, which affected Ukraine a lot, the Ukrainian government was already thinking about using such a scheme to restructure its sovereign debt. So there was a discussion, and we are coming back to this. And I think personally, it's a very good instrument that Ukraine has absolutely to look at and consider in the post-war management of its public finances. I will stop here, and I will thank you and Harold and other participants for very good comments. And with this, we are really very late with the session, but I think it's been an extremely interesting session. So with this, I would like to invite our colleague from Hungary, and I think Gabor Gyura, who is a financial consultant, but for a long time in his life, he's worked for the Central Bank of Hungary, and he's been largely involved in the design of the bank's green agenda for the last years. So I'm absolutely sure that he will have a lot to tell us and a lot to share with us in terms of how Hungary has managed to mobilize the local market and including private and sovereign issuers, and I think you are among the first ones to have issued sovereign green bonds. So it's something which we would like to particularly hear about, and as well as the role of the state in regulating the sector and providing the right incentives and signals to potential issuers. Thank you, Gabor. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning or good afternoon to everybody. So as Nelly has mentioned, I'm from Hungary, which is a former communist country. We've been a communist country until 1990, and we joined the EU in 2004. So our banking system or financial system, and especially the capital markets, are still relatively underdeveloped, even though, of course, now our legal system is based on EU law largely. So hopefully what I tell you about green bonds and how we could develop the green bond market will be useful for all participants of this conference. Let me then quickly share my presentation. I'll be quick because I know that a little bit we are running out of time for the panel. Sorry, can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I will talk about the role of the state in developing green bond markets. And let me just first give you a very brief context about Hungary. So in Hungary, we are already experiencing the impacts of climate change. On this chart, you can see how the average temperatures are rising. We are seeing an increasing intensity and frequency of floods and drought periods. Also yesterday in my city where I live, there were a flash flood. Also air pollution is a problem. And of course, water scarcity is also on the horizon. So we have all these problems. Hungary has also committed to climate neutrality until 2050. Also it is enshrined in law in Hungary. But when we take a look at the financial system, basically before 2020, we didn't have a green finance market at all. And local financial market participants seemed to largely ignore climate change and environmental topics. So we can say that we also had the so-called tragedy of horizons. So there are basically two ways forward. There were two ways forward in Hungary, how to make some progress with green bonds. And of course, in 2020, we could already see how rapidly the global green bond market has been increasing. And also, of course, we've seen at that time already issuances from Europe, also from some Baltic countries, also from Poland. So these two ways are first of all, the sovereign green bond issuance. And the second one, which I will talk about later in my presentation, is how to encourage private sector issuances in the green bond market in Hungary. So first, let's a little bit cover the sovereign market. So in 2020, this was the year when the Hungarian government established its green bond framework in line with ICMA's green bond principles. As you can see it on this chart, there were basically 6 possible green use of proceeds categories: renewable energy, land use, clean transportation, energy efficiency, water management, and climate change adaptation. Of course, all these use of proceeds are in line with the green bond principles of ICMA. And basically, there were, of course, a structure set up to oversee the selection of projects and the management of proceeds. And very importantly, of course, for investors, there was also a system set up for reporting. So the Hungarian government committed to, of course, issue allocation report and an impact report. And even more importantly, external reviewers were hired. So Cicero was the hired company to issue a second party opinion for the green finance framework. And also the impact report and allocation reports are basically reviewed by an external party, which is, I think, of course, obviously very, very important for investors and even more so for foreign investors. So far, green sovereign bonds have been issued in 4 different denominations. On this chart, you can see the composition, and altogether it's like a little bit more than 2 billion euros, which were issued already. So the first one was a euro bond. This is the largest part, and we've seen issuances in Japanese yen and also in Chinese yuan. And also we have now Hungarian forint issuance, which is extremely long. It's for 30 years, and this is the longest tenure of the Hungarian government, this 30-year maturity green bond. Taking a quick look at project allocations so far, and of course these were taken from our first allocation report. You can see on this chart that basically there is a backward-looking period of 2 years until 2018. So projects are eligible also from 2018, and basically the most parts of the program has been allocated to clean transportation, which is mainly the modernization of the Hungarian railway system. And if you want to just get an idea of how these funds were spent, of course, in many cases, it's not in clean transportation, but for instance, energy efficiency and renewable energy, it's grant payments, subsidized loans. I think it's very important also from a leverage point of view that if you use the proceeds of green bonds to offer subsidized loans to SMEs or to persons, this has a leverage effect as well. Also, tax incentives were target areas to spend the proceeds of the green bonds, and also partly operating expenditures, which is of course always a question mark for investors, and that's why it was also reviewed by the external reviewer whether the spending on operating expenditures is in line with the green bond principles, and it was found to be okay. Again, just very quickly about the impacts, because already the first impact report has been published. And also, as you can see on this picture, the impacts achieved by the green bond are mapped to the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. And as much as possible, the potential impacts are, of course, calculated in quantitative terms, in indicators, in figures. Again, the methodology for the impact report is based on ICMA's, so this International Capital Markets Association's methodology. And I won't go into the details, but I think it's very important, especially again for investors, to see how we can quantify the impacts. And lastly, on the sovereign part, let me mention the benefits from a macro point of view. So first of all, I can tell you that the issuances were all successful. We can, of course, measure the success in, for instance, pricing. So the pricing was favorable. And also maturities were, as I mentioned, very long. Probably even more importantly, the Hungarian government could issue, could reach new investors. It could diversify its investor base of bonds. The government could, let's say, reach responsible investors who were really actively looking for green assets. When it comes to the domestic issuances, it's also very important that the government could increase the supply of green assets for domestic mutual funds, because the Hungarian mutual funds are struggling to find green assets, local domestic green assets, but now at least they can buy green government bonds. And finally, I should also mention that issuing green sovereign bonds sent a very strong positive message to Hungarian financial entities, signaling the commitment of the government about green finance, and actually private sector participants followed suit. And this leads me to the second part of my presentation, how the government, and even more so the Central Bank of Hungary, has been encouraging private sector issuances. Here I should first start with, again, just showing this picture. It's a comparison of Eastern European countries. And before 2020, there were no private sector green bond issuances in Hungary. Whereas, as you can see in this picture, in Poland, in Lithuania, Slovenia, there already were some private sector green bond issuances. But as of 2022 first quarter, a very significant part compared to our GDP have been issued in green bonds, either by corporations or by banks. So it looks like we were able to jumpstart a green bond market, even though on this picture you can see that we were facing a lot of barriers. So first of all, the underdeveloped nature of Hungarian capital markets. So we had a very small bond market at that time. And actually there was very little awareness among banks as potential investors about green finance. And on this chart, you can see that very few banks identified any opportunity with climate change, and even less so with green bonds. And as I already mentioned, we had been struggling with mutual funds. We have had a very small penetration of ESG mandated mutual funds. Less than 1% of mutual funds had ESG in its investment policy. But by the end of 2021, the share of green corporate bonds reached about 10% of the Hungarian corporate bond market. And when it comes to green covered bonds issued by banks, we could exceed 8.7%, which is already above European average. And on this chart, you can also see the composition. So of course, the most important part are senior sovereign bonds, but we already have now a sizable green corporate bond portfolio and also some green mortgage bonds issued by banks. What had happened? What were the measures that helped to jumpstart private sector issuance? And these are the measures from the Central Bank of Hungary, in addition to the government sending the signal with the sovereign bond issuance. And here the central bank did a number of measures. First of all, it used prudential regulation applicable to banks to provide incentive for banks to buy and look for green assets. We introduced capital requirements, incentives for green loans and the buying of green bonds, and also liquidity requirements, incentives for banks to issue green covered bonds. As part of the monetary policy measures, the central bank launched a corporate bond asset purchase scheme, similarly to the European Central Bank. There was no green element in this thing, but it was very important because corporations, let's say, toying with the idea to issue a green corporate bond, could count with the central bank's corporate bond purchase scheme. And for green covered bonds issued by banks, there was and there is still a dedicated central bank purchase scheme for such assets. And finally, let me mention other examples, other measures by the central bank. For instance, leading by example, the Hungarian central bank itself bought foreign green bonds into its FX reserves portfolio. And we were doing a lot of awareness raising and capacity building, and even issuing a manual for corporations how to issue green bonds. Just very briefly, a few words about the capital requirement scheme, which is I think, very interesting, and we've received a lot of interest from other countries. So in very short terms, banks can use lower capital requirements if they buy green bonds compared to traditional bonds. And basically the definition is based on the ICMA's green bond principles, and banks can enjoy or use higher discounts if the green bonds are issued according to the EU taxonomy, so the future EU green bond standards. And this measure has proved to be effective, again, to encourage banks to act as investors of green bonds, and of course, together with corporations and the interest of corporations to do more green projects, and for that reason to issue green corporate bonds, together combined with these incentives for banks to purchase such assets. This measure so far proved to be effective to jumpstart green corporate issuances. That was very quick. I hope I could also help with keeping the time for the conference. And of course, if there are any questions, I'm really happy to answer you.
Thank you very much, Gabor. I think it was, again, a very comprehensive presentation with a lot of ideas that can be applicable in the markets in our region. I think I don't see any questions from the floor right now. And thank you for being flexible. For this reason, I think we will move to the next session. I just wanted to say that on our side and the countries that we work with in the region, we have a lot to learn from countries like yours, like Lithuania, like others in the region that have gone through this process. And we will stay in touch and definitely get back to you with a request to discuss this more and to see how we can use your country's experience in our both analysis, but also to transfer this experience to the countries in the region that may be interested to learn more about it. Because obviously the state as a regulator can do a lot to support the development of the market. And the right signals that a sovereign issuers can send is really crucial to mobilize private, both corporate and financial potential issues down the line. So thank you once again for being with us and for sharing your experience.